again, the way that the current monetary system is structured is that all other fiats will fail first before the dollar finally fails. And actually, ironically, the dollar strengthening is a sign of stress in the system, not a sign of, American ingenuity or American innovation or American exceptionalism.
What's happening maybe in London at the Bank of England? What do you see going on in gold?
Yeah, the gold market is extremely chaotic. And there's been like essentially what I would call a liquidity crisis at the BOE and at the London Gold Pool building for the last 4 or 5 months. So starting in 2023 and then in 2024, we started to see more and more redemptions coming for physical gold out of Shanghai, out of the SGEI, which is the Chinese gold exchange. And that started putting a draw on Western markets for physical gold redemptions. And we saw the COMEX slowly being drained as well as the LBMA being drained of the physical gold. But all of that went into overdrive just in January and February of this year as net redemptions at the COMEX for January, for example, soared to 19,000 contracts, which for reference, that's about 4 to 5 times the normal monthly, January redemption amount. And that equates to 1.9 million ounces of physical gold. So that amount of gold withdrawal meant that the COMEX panicked and had to find their own, gold elsewhere and refill their coffers, so to speak. Because again, one of the worst things that you can do for business as an exchange, especially as a gold exchange, is to actually run out of gold. Because suddenly now nobody wants to use you as an exchange because you just don't have any gold. So the COMEX started drawing in all their outstanding IOU or gold certificates that are gold IOUs at the LBMA. So that started draining London. And as these London vaults were being drained, the London gold banks, the brokers all started going to the Bank of England for more liquidity because they said, hey, we've drawn down 20, 30, 40% of our gold supply. We're starting to get low. We need to have excess gold liquidity. And so they all started draining the Bank of England's own gold through their borrow program, and the lease rate for the Bank of England's gold, skyrocketed from where it is usually, which is like 25 basis points, to like 6%, 7%, which is the biggest percentage increase that they've ever had in history. And the wait times at the BOE extended to 6 to 8 weeks. So there was basically like a huge wait time for the amount of gold that these banks were requesting for physical delivery. We also saw a strain in the ETFs and even like gold stocks where like the GLD ETF, for example, saw the borrow rate in the ETF. So basically the amount of money you pay to borrow shares of the ETF spike from like 1% to like 7 or 8%. And again, the reason why these banks and hedge funds were doing that is because you can actually redeem, if you're an authorized participant, which basically means if you're a bank, you can actually redeem the gold, the GLD shares, the ETF shares for physical gold. So what you can do is you can take those you can borrow the shares or you can buy them, and you can take them to, HSBC and JPM, which are the authorized participants for the ETF, and you can redeem them for shares of physical gold for bars or for coins or whatever they have there. And so people were now draining the ETFs of their gold because they needed physical liquidity. And all this is to say that there's basically institutional gold demand reemerging as a major driving factor in the gold price for the next 2-3 years going forwards. And that's what's really driving the gold price higher. Because for decades, just like with GameStop, right, with the naked shorting, we've seen, naked shorting essentially, or paper contracts in the gold market balloon to, the hundreds of times of the amount of gold that is in the vaults. So, the estimate is for London, for example, that there's 200 to 300 paper ounces of gold for every 1 physical ounce. In the US, it's not as extreme, but it's still bad, like 80 ounces of paper gold, 100 ounces of paper gold for every 1 ounce of physical gold. And that system works, right? As long as you don't actually request delivery, as long as nobody really wants the physical gold delivered on their doorstep. The minute that everybody wants their physical gold, this little game of hot potato, this little game of charades where everyone's just passing around, a single gold coin and 10 promises for it. Now suddenly everybody wants the gold coin. And that's what's happening. And that causes the paper markets, which is, the LBMA and the COMEX, to start to break and to rip the gold price upwards in order to compensate for that demand.
Yeah, right. It's very interesting watching gold. Maybe it's a canary in the coal mine. How does maybe the DXY falling? I think everyone gets excited for that, but how does that maybe strengthen the current system?
So that's a great question. Actually, I had a really good tweet about that today, and people have been DMing me, asking me, because I've said that a lot. Like, the irony is that the lower Dixie goes, the stronger the system gets. And people are like, what? That makes no sense. It's like, no, it actually makes perfect sense. Again, when you think about it, it's counterintuitive, but it makes sense. And the reason why is because the current system, the way it's structured, is that there's trillions and trillions of dollars of external dollar debts that are swirling around in the global debt markets. These are called Eurodollars. So this is like a Pakistani bank making a loan to an Iranian oil supplier, or a Chinese commercial bank making a loan to a Japanese fishery. Like it's these kinds of transactions. But all these transactions are denominated in dollars. So these foreign banks are loaning dollars into existence and creating dollar loans. Now the problem is, now suddenly all these external, corporations, counterparties, entities, hedge funds, whatever, now they all have dollar debt they have to service. And since they're earning in their local currency, they have to go to the local foreign exchange market, transact those rupees or yen or yuan back into dollars, and then pay off their dollar debts. When the dollar system, or when the dollar or Dixie weakens, it makes it easier and cheaper for them to pay off their debt. That means that those entities, those fisheries, those mining companies, those oil suppliers will go out and borrow even more. Because for one, interest rates probably at home are still relatively low, and for two, the dollar is weak comparatively. So it's a great time to borrow. And because, again, your incomes are artificially high because of this weaker dollar. Because of that, more and more dollar debt builds up in the system. More and more people are leveraged, and more people are highly leveraged. And that means that every time the dollar system starts to spike again, it causes more damage, and then the system demands even more liquidity to bail everybody out. But as long as the dollar remains weak, that actually encourages dollar borrowing, that encourages the creation of more debt, and that means that, again, future demand for dollars grows. Because in a system where money is loaned into existence, the more money you loan into existence, the more demand you create for that future dollar.
I think that Bitcoin still ascends to infinity, but I see a much longer road ahead for the dollar through stable coins and the Bitcoin dollar. I'm just trying to grok that. So I'd love to hear your take.
That's actually what I would agree with. The way that the current monetary system is structured is that all other fiats will fail first before the dollar finally fails. And actually, ironically, the dollar strengthening is a sign of stress in the system, not a sign of, American ingenuity or American innovation or American exceptionalism. So the longer the system goes on, like we said, and the weaker the dollar gets, the stronger it gets. And the longer the system goes on, in general, even with the dollar index staying flat, the more debt is created. Again, because every single year, you have, like, let's just put numbers on it. Let's say there's $10 trillion of dollar debt outstanding, and that's rated at 5%. Well, to pay off all that debt, you now need 5% more dollars the next year to pay that off. And those dollars mostly are loaned into existence by the banks. And so now in the next calendar year, you have $100.5 trillion of debt. And so, again, you can see at these fiat systems, as this time goes on, the debt just builds and builds and builds and builds and builds and builds. And it just does not stop until there's a major event, like a major war, a devaluation, a hyperinflation, a deflation, a default, something to completely reset the system. And the way the global monetary system is structured means that all these other regional fiats will collapse first and harder and basically lose their energy and purchasing power into the dollar before the dollar does finally die. Now, the dollar, of course, will die eventually, because we're talking about an entity that is fighting the financial gravity of ever increasing debt and ever increasing QE in order to just stay alive and keep the wheels on the bus. And so eventually that ends in disaster. But the point is, it ends for the dollar. The dollar is the last man standing in this game. And so of all the currencies to be bearish on, the dollar is the worst one to be bearish on for the duration of this system. Now, with regards to actual timeline, again, I would say I would take the over like 10 to 15 years for the dollar system to really start dying. You have to see major signposts like, the yen collapsing, the yuan collapsing, currency crisis throughout Latin America, and dollarization of more countries, basically making more countries like El Salvador or Panama adopting the dollar as a currency and getting rid of their own. You have to see that becoming much more commonplace before you start, thinking that we're actually towards the end of this end game. We're still in the middle, I would say the middle chapters.